Hello and welcome. I am Tootight Lautrec, the Master Mistress of Glitterature Alley, and here we are once again at the bottom of the down staircase in the permanently sequestered remainders section of an unnamed local library, which may or may not have a couple of lions couchant looking mildly amused, but having really not very much to say, very much like me after reading this week's selection for Pulitzer Who, which is the 1945 Pulitzer Prize winner for the novel A Bell for Adano by John Hersey. It's not exactly a war story, but it is sort of. It's about a small town in Italy, the fictional town of Adano in Sicily, which the Americans have taken over after ousting the fascists during World War II. And once the basic needs of the citizens have been met, like food, water, and a fair and just return to order, the main concern for everyone is that they get a replacement for the 700-year-old bell that the fascists have melted down for bullets. And they want this bell returned, or not returned, but replaced, so that the town once again has a bell, hence the name, A Bell for Adano. But before we get into all of that, let us look at some of the other books that didn't make the cut, that were published in 1944. And among those are Anna and the King of Siam by Margaret Landon, Boston Adventure by Jean Stafford, Dangling Man by Saul Bellow, The Dark Tunnel by Kenneth Miller, which was later subtitled The Story of a Homosexual Spy, a book I had never heard of, but I may be looking into at some point or other. The Lost Weekend by Charles R. Jackson, Presidential Agent by, oh looky here, the ubiquitous Upton Sinclair, The Steep Ascent by Anne Morrow Lindbergh, yes, that's Charles Lindbergh's wife, Strange Fruit by Lillian Smith, but the Pulitzer Prize, the 1945 Pulitzer Prize for the novel, goes to A Bell for Adano by John Hersey. Here it is again. So, John Hersey was a fiction writer and a journalist. He was born June 17th, 1914, and he lived until March 24th, 1993. He was born in China, and he lived there with his missionary parents for 10 years until they moved back to the United States and settled in New York. He graduated from Yale and later became a war correspondent during World War II. He wrote 26 books, fiction and nonfiction, in his lifetime, and A Bell for Adano is his third book that he published. So, A Bell for Adano. Americans conquer a small town in Sicily called Adano. They expel the fascists. There is a Major Victor Giuppolo, who is an Italian-American who speaks fluent Italian, and he is put in charge of the town. And we learn from the very start that he is a good man. Most of the book involves Giuppolo's humorous interactions with the inhabitants of the town, his desire to earn their trust, his desire to make life better for them, and his desire to get a replacement for the bell which the fascists melted down for bullets. And that is about the entire book. It's not particularly deep or philosophical. There are descriptions of good people and of bad people. There are depictions of foolish desires and earnest desires, some of which are satisfied and some of which are thwarted. And as I mentioned, it is slightly humorous. There's a slightly humorous quality throughout the narrative that sometimes felt, to me, mocking or dismissive, or that relied on somewhat worn stereotypes. And this kept me from becoming deeply involved in what happens. Jokes that make fun of ethnicities or ethnic stereotypes, to me, seem cheap and easy, and in the end, not all that funny. And each scene in A Bell for Adano seemed more to me like a showcase for absurd behavior or funny character traits, more an opportunity for cheap jokes than it did for any kind of setup of a tension in the narrative that would be satisfied or realized later on. And as far as tension goes in the novel, there were 2 points of what I would call suspense. Very early in the novel, a general, and by the way, a general outranks a major, a general who we learn is a bad man, gets annoyed at a mule cart blocking his way as he's trying to get into Adano. So the general has the mule killed and signs an executive order sort of thing, banning carts, all carts, from going in and coming out of the town of Adano. And Major Jopolo, Major, who is a lower rank than the general, understands that the town needs those carts to come in and out in order to give them food and water and to restore their standard of living that they had before the fascists took over. So he gives his men, because the general has gone away, he's probably never going to come to Adano again. Major Jopolo gives his men a counter order to what the general's order was. Now, Jopolo's men understand that, yes, the town does need these carts, but they're also afraid that they'll get in trouble for enacting the counter order to the general's executive order. So they go to the trouble of writing up a report that Jopolo made them do it, and it went against the general's order, but they had no choice. And they file this report so that it gets lost among papers, it gets shuffled from one desk to another, and if it does finally get mailed somewhere, it'll get mailed to Africa or some other desk that doesn't cover any of the general's orders. So they try to lose the order, but they want to have it on record just in case. So because of this purpose misfiling and misdirection of it, all through the novel, we see that piece of paper land here and there and be dismissed and sent along to some other place. So there's this tension of, will the piece of paper ever reach the general again? There's a second source of tension, which is, how will Major Jopolo actually finagle getting a suitable bell for the inhabitants of Adano? So both of these tensions are resolved one way or another by the end of the book, and you'll have to read the book for yourself to find out how that happens. So you might ask, Tootight Lautrec, Master Mistress of Glitterature Alley and former drag laureate of the Sanitarium, what kept you reading and what stopped you reading? Thank you for asking. What kept me reading? It's an enjoyable read. It's lightly humorous, as I said, so it kept me, entertained throughout. But because of the way that it is humorous, even the tragedies of war that occur here and there throughout the narrative kept me from feeling too much about these tragedies, and that was a bit of a drawback for me. And of course, what also kept me reading was that I did want to see what happened with this bell, if they got the bell for Adano. Qualms. Did I have qualms? I had some qualms. Mostly, I've been trying to figure out how to characterize the humor in this book. It didn't necessarily bother me, but it did keep me at a distance, and it kept me from really taking anything very seriously. And that, for me, is a drawback. And because normally I love humor. But as I said before, it was kind of a parade of stereotypes. There are lazy Italians, there are brusque, rude Americans, there are selfish men in power, and there are Italian women who are either fat and obnoxious, or pretty and slutty, or pretty and nice. And it got me thinking about which novels I like that really are, or even short stories, which are funny and that are funny in a successful way. And I thought about Nabokov's Humbert Humbert in Lolita with the sentence, "You can always count on a madman for a fancy prose style." And that sentence itself is funny because it puts two things together that ordinarily would not belong together, and it points out the absurdity and at the same time reveals something about the character who says it about himself. There's also Jane Austen's snarky, pithy, witty kind of humor, which you can find in something like Sense and Sensibility, where Marianne Dashwood, who's high spirited and a bit histrionic, histrionically bemoans having to leave their home and declares that she'll never be able to get over having to leave her home, even as the trees die off in winter. And her sister Eleanor very dryly says, "It is not everyone who shares your passion for dead leaves, Marianne." And this, to me, points out the absurdity of Marianne's histrionics over these mundane things, but it does so in a very pithy, dry way. And then there's humor in the simple joy of language, as in James Joyce's Ulysses, where Stephen Dedalus is thinking about his time in Paris, where the men walk around among the women with their well-pleased pleasers and their curled conquistadors trying to control them among all the pretty women of Paris. So just the fun of the language of that is something that is humorous and would keep one going. But here in A Bell for Adano, it's often, as I said before, ethnic humor or insult humor, where the characters insult one another about being either dumb or fat or sloppy or irascible or too particular. And in the end, it's just too easy of a shot for me anyway, and not all that funny after a while. So it feels like kind of a middle of the road sitcom rather than anything really uproarious and new. And again, if you rely on stereotypes for your humor, it has kind of a dehumanizing effect where we're unable to sympathize with or to identify with any of the characters or to even be properly repulsed by any of the characters because it's a type and it's not a reflection of a true human being or of human behavior. So while mildly amusing, this novel kept me from becoming too deeply involved in whatever happens. It was just a book. So now you might wonder, do I recommend it? Sure. Mildly amusing is fine. If you're up for a giggle or a snicker or a Klondike bar, this might be for you. It went down easily. Was it wonderful? No, it was not wonderful, which doesn't mean that there was no wonder, but it wasn't brimming with wonder. You had to really look for it, which I guess is a lesson for us all. Because look around, wonder is there. When you find it, pay attention. I am Tootight Lautrec. Until we meet again. Mwah.